The town of Brookdale was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the grocery store clerk remembered your favorite cereal, and the postman waved at you by name. It was safe, predictable, and ordinary until the trial. Suddenly, that sense of calm dissolved. For weeks, Brookdale had been buzzing with hushed conversations, speculation, and pointed glances across coffee shop counters. Neighbors whispered at barbershops and bakeries, dividing themselves into camps without ever saying so out loud. Some believed the mother was being unfairly accused of neglect. Others said the child's bruises and late-night police calls told a story no one could ignore. By the time the case reached the courthouse, the town's nerves were stretched thin. Reporters, drawn by the unusual drama in a quiet place, filled the back pews with notepads and cameras. Families who had lived side by side for decades now avoided each other's eyes on Main Street. The trial wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about Brookdale's reputation, its values, and its secrets. The courthouse itself seemed to sag under the weight of expectation. Its stone columns and wooden doors had seen traffic violations and property disputes, but never anything that threatened to divide the community so deeply. On trial was not only a woman accused of failing her child, but the town's ability to confront truths it would rather look away from. Inside, the air felt thick. Ceiling fans turned lazily, but they couldn't break the tension pressing down on the wooden benches. Every cough, every shuffle of a shoe seemed to echo through the chamber. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Coleman, organized his notes with mechanical precision. He was relentless in his pursuit of justice, known for pushing hard on cases involving children. Across from him sat defense attorney Linda Pierce, her eyes cool but fierce. She believed her client, the child's mother, had been misunderstood, misjudged, and mistreated by a system quick to assume the worst. At the bench, Judge Miriam Hayes adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. She was not a woman easily swayed by sentiment. For 30 years she had presided over hearings, and she prided herself on keeping emotion out of her rulings. Yet even she felt the tension thrumming beneath the surface. This was no ordinary trial. This was a story that had wrapped its fingers around an entire community, and everyone was waiting to see who would break first. The benches behind the lawyers told their own story. On the left sat townspeople who supported the mother churchgoers, family friends and neighbors who had seen her volunteer at school events and church suppers. They whispered that she was overwhelmed, perhaps struggling, but not cruel. On the right sat those who had called the police when things went too far, who had heard the screams through thin walls and watched a little girl shrink into herself at playgrounds. They believed the mother had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Divided down the middle, the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a battlefield, with the child herself caught in the crossfire. The first days of testimony had dragged on, each side presenting evidence that seemed to cancel the other out. Photographs of bruises clashed with testimonies from neighbors, swearing the child had been clumsy. Reports from social workers conflicted with tearful assurances from relatives who said the mother loved her daughter deeply. The jury, 12 ordinary men and women from Brookdale, watched with weary eyes. They had been pulled from their routines, asked to weigh truths that were tangled in emotion, loyalty, and fear. By the third week, the town's patience was fraying. Every evening, families gathered at kitchen tables debating what they'd heard that day. In diners, strangers leaned over booths to argue about whether the bruises were accidents or abuse. Even the pastor at the local church had been drawn into it, urging his congregation to pray not just for truth, but for unity, though unity seemed far away. Yet, beneath all the arguments and speculation, everyone knew the trial hinged on one thing: the testimony of a 3-year-old girl named Emily. She was the center of the storm. The child whose life had been lived behind closed doors, where the real story lingered. Her name wasn't spoken often in the courtroom, but the weight of her presence was undeniable. Both sides wanted her voice, yet both feared it. Could a toddler's words be trusted? Could she even find the courage to speak in front of strangers, lawyers, and the towering figure of the judge? The judge had postponed her testimony for as long as possible, allowing the lawyers to argue their evidence before asking Emily to appear. But everyone in the courtroom knew the day was coming, and it loomed over them like a storm cloud waiting to break. When word spread that Emily would be brought in, Brookdale seemed to hold its breath. The courthouse filled earlier than usual that morning. Reporters elbowed for space, townspeople leaned forward on the benches, and the jury sat straighter in their seats. Nobody knew what to expect. Some whispered that a child so young could barely string together sentences. Others insisted children never lied. Everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever Emily said or didn't say would decide the case. Outside, the sky was a pale gray, as though even the weather hesitated. A group of mothers huddled near the courthouse steps, their arms folded, whispering about their own children. A farmer in mud-stained boots shook his head, muttering that kids were too fragile to be dragged through courtrooms. Yet still they came, unable to resist the pull of history unfolding in their town. Inside, the bailiff cleared his throat, signaling the judge's arrival. Conversations died down. Wooden pews creaked as the crowd rose. Judge Hayes entered, her robe flowing, and the room fell into a silence so complete it seemed unnatural. She adjusted her glasses, looked over the sea of anxious faces, and nodded for everyone to sit. The trial was about to take a new turn, and everyone knew it. Somewhere in the courthouse, a child no taller than the bench she'd soon sit on was waiting. She carried no notes, no rehearsed statements, no legal training, only the memories that weighed far too heavily on someone so young. The people of Brookdale sat frozen, divided by loyalty and fear, yet united in one unspoken truth. The fate of the trial rested not on the seasoned attorneys, nor the stern judge, but on the fragile voice of a 3-year-old girl. And when she entered that courtroom, she would either break its silence or let it swallow her whole. The double doors of the courthouse opened slowly, and all heads turned as Officer Daniels guided Emily into the room. She was so small, she barely cleared the edge of the benches, her steps uncertain on the polished floor. She clutched a stuffed rabbit, its fur worn thin from years of love, and her other hand held tightly onto the officer's. For a moment, the courtroom forgot to breathe. Emily was only 3, yet every person in that room knew she carried more weight on her shoulders than many adults. She did not understand what a courtroom was, nor the reason strangers sat in rows staring at her with anxious eyes. All she understood was that she had been told to be brave, and that the people waiting inside wanted her to speak. To her, the world was still a place of bedtime stories and picture books. But the hushed murmurs, the echo of footsteps, and the towering figure of the judge made it feel like something else entirely, something frightening. She clung to her rabbit, whispering words only it could hear. The jury, who had listened to endless hours of testimony from experts and neighbors, now leaned forward as though drawn by invisible strings. Their gazes softened, shifting from skepticism to quiet sympathy. This was not a hardened witness, nor a calculating adult with motives. This was a child pure, unfiltered, untouched by legal tactics. Whatever she might say, it would come from a place no lawyer could script. The prosecutor, Richard Coleman, watched her closely. His sharp features, often hardened by the weight of his cases, seemed to soften. He had children of his own, though older now, and for a brief moment he saw not just a witness, but a daughter. He reminded himself, though, that the stakes were too high for sentiment. Emily's words could tip the scales, but only if she could find the courage to speak. Across the room, defense attorney Linda Pierce tapped her pen nervously. She had argued passionately that a child so young could not understand truth from fiction, that memory was fragile, that imagination could blur reality. Yet even she could not deny the gravity of Emily's presence. It was hard to imagine this fragile little girl fabricating anything. Still, Linda knew that emotions often outweighed logic in the minds of jurors, and she braced herself for the tide she feared was coming. Judge Hayes, who had presided over countless trials, watched Emily with an expression that betrayed none of her thoughts. Yet something flickered in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, that the law was about to collide with innocence in a way it rarely did. She adjusted her glasses and nodded toward the bailiff to help Emily into her seat. The child was lifted gently onto the witness chair, her legs swinging in the air, far too short to touch the ground. Her rabbit sat on her lap, its button eyes staring out into the courtroom as if to share the burden of attention. Emily's wide eyes darted around the room, taking in the sea of strangers. She didn't understand why they were here. She only understood that everyone was waiting for her. Her mother sat at the defense table, her face pale and drawn. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes as she watched her daughter sit there, so small, so vulnerable. To the mother, this moment was unbearable. Every fiber of her being wanted to rush forward, scoop Emily into her arms, and shield her from the weight of the trial. But she could not. She could only sit, restrained by law and consequence, and hope the child's words would not condemn her forever. The crowd held its breath as the prosecutor approached the stand. His voice, usually firm and commanding, was softened, almost trembling with the responsibility of the task. He knelt slightly, so his eyes were level with hers. "Hello, Emily," he said gently. "Do you know why you're here today?" Emily blinked, clutching her rabbit tighter. She shook her head slightly, her lips pressing together in silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The weight of expectation pressed down heavier with each passing second. "That's okay," Richard said quickly. "You don't have to understand everything. We just want you to tell us some things you remember. That's all." Emily's gaze dropped to her rabbit. She stroked its ear nervously, her small fingers trembling. The courtroom waited, the silence almost unbearable. The defense attorney watched closely, ready to argue that any word she uttered was unreliable. The prosecutor hoped for something, anything, that might tip the case. The judge waited with patience, but even she felt the weight of every second stretching too long. Finally, Emily spoke not to the prosecutor, but to her rabbit. "I don't like it here," she whispered softly. Though the words weren't directed to anyone else, the room caught them like a spark in dry grass. They were small, fragile words, but they carried a truth everyone felt. She was scared, overwhelmed, and lost. Richard tried again, his voice tender. "I know it's scary, but do you remember things from home? Do you remember what happened with Mommy?" Emily shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted toward the towering figure of her mother, then quickly back to her rabbit. She hugged it tight, as though the stuffed animal could protect her from the eyes of the room. Her silence stretched again, and whispers rippled across the benches. Some jurors glanced at each other. Could she really testify? Could she really carry this trial on her tiny shoulders? The defense attorney leaned back, almost smug. This was her argument come to life, that expecting truth from a toddler was impossible. She scribbled a note and slid it across to her client, who read it with trembling hands. But then Emily did something unexpected. She looked not at the prosecutor, not at her mother, not at the jury, but at the police dog seated quietly at the edge of the room. Rex, the K9, had been brought in only to provide comfort, not to participate. Yet his calm presence caught Emily's attention. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes softening. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she seemed less afraid. She leaned toward the rabbit, whispering again. But this time her eyes flicked toward Rex, The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. They could sense something shifting, something fragile but important. Emily wasn't ready to speak to adults. She wasn't ready to face the weight of their questions. But maybe, just maybe, she was ready to talk to the one presence in the room who expected nothing of her but honesty. Her mother closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The prosecutor straightened, sensing a glimmer of hope. The defense attorney frowned, knowing something beyond her control was unfolding. Judge Hayes watched carefully, her gavel untouched. For once, the strict boundaries of law seemed less important than the human truth hovering just beyond Emily's lips. The child at the center of it all sat quietly, her stuffed rabbit pressed close, her eyes lingering on Rex. In that moment, she was not a witness, not a symbol, not a pawn in legal arguments. She was simply a little girl, trembling but searching for the courage to speak. And though she hadn't said much yet, the courtroom knew. When her voice finally broke through the silence, it would change everything. The air inside the courtroom was heavy when the side door creaked open again. For a moment, the jurors and spectators thought another witness had been called. Instead, it was Officer Daniels, tall and broad-shouldered in his Navy uniform, leading a German shepherd by a leather leash. The animal's nails clicked against the hardwood floor, a steady rhythm that broke the tension just enough to draw every eye toward him. The whispers began instantly. A police dog? In the middle of a trial this serious? Some leaned forward with curiosity. Others frowned with disbelief. This wasn't a drug bust or a manhunt. This was a courtroom, sacred in its order, and introducing an animal felt almost absurd. But for Officer Daniels, this was not absurd. It was necessary. He had been on the force for nearly 15 years, and in that time, he had seen children fold in on themselves, silenced by fear. He had seen them retreat into worlds so private, no amount of coaxing could reach them. But Rex, his partner, had a gift. Where adults failed, Rex succeeded. Where words faltered, his presence created safety. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow as the officer approached the bench. "Explain this," she said firmly, though her tone carried curiosity rather than outright disapproval. "Your Honor," Daniels replied, his voice steady but respectful. "This is Rex. He's been trained for victim support, especially with children. He doesn't testify. He doesn't interfere. He simply sits, so the child feels safe enough to speak." The judge studied the dog. Rex stood calmly by Daniel's side, ears alert but not aggressive, his gaze sweeping the room as though taking measure of every soul inside. Then his eyes landed on Emily, and something in the air shifted. His tail wagged once, slow and deliberate, and Emily's grip on her rabbit loosened ever so slightly. "Proceed," Judge Hayes said after a pause. "But the court will remain orderly." Daniels guided Rex to the witness stand and settled him at Emily's feet. The dog lowered himself gracefully, his body language relaxed, his head tilted slightly as though waiting. Emily's wide eyes studied him with wonder. She had seen dogs before, of course on the street, in picture books, but never one like this. This one seemed to see her, not just look at her. The jury murmured softly. One older man on the panel shook his head with skepticism, but another, a young mother of two, covered her mouth with her hand as her eyes glistened. She understood what comfort meant to a child. The defense attorney rose quickly, objecting. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Allowing an animal in the courtroom could prejudice the jury. They may interpret the dog's presence as an emotional tool rather than a neutral aid." The prosecutor countered immediately. "The child is 3 years old. She cannot be cross-examined in the same way an adult can. This dog is not evidence, nor is he testimony. He is simply support." All eyes turned back to the judge. After a long silence, Hayes lifted her chin. The objection is overruled. The child may have the dog remain by her side. The decision sent ripples through the courtroom. Some sighed with relief, others shook their heads in disapproval. But Emily didn't notice any of it. Her gaze never left Rex. Officer Daniels gave her a gentle nod, then stepped back, allowing Rex to do what he did best. The dog lay close, his fur brushing against Emily's shoes. Slowly, cautiously, Emily reached down and touched him. Her fingers sank into the softness of his coat. A tiny smile flickered at the corner of her lips, the first one since she'd entered the room. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. Her shoulders, once tense, began to relax. She leaned slightly toward the dog, as though drawn into his steady warmth. The rabbit still sat in her lap, but her other hand now rested on Rex's neck, stroking absently as though she'd known him forever. The crowd watched, captivated. For all the hours of testimony, for all the heated arguments between attorneys, nothing had changed the atmosphere of the courtroom as much as this one simple connection. Richard Coleman, the prosecutor, sensed opportunity. He approached slowly, his voice quieter than before. "Emily," he said gently, "can you tell Rex something about your home?" Emily blinked, her lips parting, but she said nothing. Her eyes darted toward her mother at the defense table, then back to Rex. She bent her head, whispering something too soft for the microphones to catch. Rex's ears flicked. The courtroom leaned in, straining to hear. "Can you say it louder, sweetheart?" Coleman asked, careful not to push too hard. Emily pressed her face into Rex's fur and whispered again. This time, though muffled, the words carried just enough to reach the nearest rows. "I was scared." Gasps rippled across the benches. The words were simple, but they carried a weight no adult testimony had managed to capture. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, the image of a frightened child planting itself firmly in their minds. Linda Pierce, the defense attorney, shot to her feet. "Objection. Leading the witness." "Overruled," the judge said firmly. The child spoke freely. Rex lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes watching Emily as though encouraging her. She giggled softly, a sound startling in its sweetness amid the tension of the room. It was not the giggle of joy, but of relief, the kind a child gives when they feel seen, even in fear. Officer Daniels remained at the edge of the room, his face unreadable, but his chest swelling with quiet pride. He had trusted Rex to reach her, and Rex had delivered. The prosecutor decided to step back, realizing that pushing too much could shatter the fragile trust Emily had just found. The jury didn't need more right now. They had heard the most important truth, a child's unguarded fear, spoken not to adults, not to authority, but to a friend who asked nothing in return. As the court adjourned for recess, murmurs filled the air again. Reporters scribbled furiously, already imagining headlines about the dog who broke the silence. Neighbors whispered, their arguments temporarily silenced by the undeniable bond they had just witnessed. Emily slid from her chair and wrapped both arms around Rex's neck. For the first time since the trial began, she looked less like a witness and more like what she truly was, a child, desperate for comfort in a world too big for her. And though the case was far from over, one thing had become clear to everyone in the room. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was the bridge between silence and truth. The courtroom felt heavier than ever when the recess ended. People returned to their benches with hushed voices, their footsteps echoing across the chamber. Outside, the sun was bright, but in here, the air was dense, almost suffocating. Everyone knew what was coming. The bailiff called the court back to order, and Judge Hayes entered with her usual composure. Yet even she could not erase the tension that gripped the room. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the faces before her, and finally settled her gaze on Emily. The little girl sat once more at the witness stand, her stuffed rabbit perched on her lap. Rex was curled neatly at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his breathing slow and steady. Emily's hand occasionally drifted down to stroke his fur, the only sign that she still drew comfort from him. The prosecutor, Richard Coleman, rose to his feet. His notes were stacked neatly in his hands, though he hardly looked at them. This wasn't about documents or rehearsed lines. This was about a 3-year-old girl who held more truth than any piece of paper. "Emily," he began softly, keeping his tone low and gentle. "I know it's hard to be here. I know you don't want to talk to all these people. But remember, you don't have to look at us. You can talk to Rex if that feels easier." Emily's lips pressed together. She glanced at the rows of strangers staring at her, then buried her face against her rabbit. The silence stretched. The jury leaned forward, straining to see every flicker of her expression. The defense attorney tapped her pen against the table, an almost impatient rhythm. The mother sat frozen, her eyes rimmed with red, her hands gripping the edge of her chair until her knuckles whitened. Richard waited, his patience deliberate. He knew pressing too soon could cause her to retreat entirely. Still, he felt the weight of the silence bearing down on him. The judge shifted slightly in her seat. "You may proceed," she said quietly, though the words carried more like a reminder than permission. Richard crouched slightly, lowering himself to Emily's eye level. "Can you tell Rex how you're feeling right now?" Emily's throat moved as she swallowed. Her hands tightened around her rabbit, and she whispered something too faint to hear. Rex lifted his head, ears pricking at the sound. The dog gave a soft huff, as though answering her. "What was that, sweetheart?" Richard asked. Her lips trembled. She tried again, a little louder this time. "Scared." A murmur ran through the courtroom. One word. Just one, but it rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. The defense attorney was on her feet in an instant. "Objection. This is emotional manipulation, Your Honor. A child this age, overruled," Judge Hayes said firmly. "The child is testifying in her own words." Linda Pierce sat down reluctantly, though her eyes never left Emily. Richard gave a small nod, grateful. "That's okay, Emily. You're being very brave. Can you tell Rex what makes you scared?" The silence returned, heavier this time. Emily's fingers twisted the rabbit's ear until the fabric stretched thin. Her eyes darted around the room, landing briefly on her mother. For a moment, she seemed ready to speak, but then she clammed up again, retreating into silence. The defense attorney smirked faintly. To her, this was proof enough that the child couldn't handle testimony. She scribbled another note, likely preparing her argument for dismissal. But the jury was not unmoved. Several of them shifted uncomfortably, unable to look away from the little girl struggling with words too heavy for her age. A mother on the panel dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. An older man clenched his jaw, his arms folded tightly across his chest. The silence stretched on. Seconds felt like minutes. The ceiling fan above clattered faintly, the only sound cutting through the tension. The audience sat perfectly still, their anticipation building with each beat of silence. Emily hugged her rabbit to her chest and whispered again, this time directly into Rex's ear. Nobody else heard it. Rex's tail thumped once against the wooden floor, a soft sound that echoed like a drumbeat in the hushed room. Richard sensed movement, leaned closer. "Can you say it so Rex can share it with us too?" Emily's lips quivered. She looked at the dog, then back at her rabbit. Finally, she whispered. Loud, too loud. The words were cryptic to some, but the prosecutor recognized their weight. He pressed carefully. "Do you mean at home?" Emily nodded, her face pressed against her rabbit again. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, ready to object once more. But even she seemed to sense that interrupting would only draw more sympathy toward the child. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, full of meaning, full of possibility. The entire courtroom sat suspended, hanging on every tiny syllable Emily might release next. The mother's tears slid silently down her cheeks. She mouthed something no one could hear, perhaps, "I'm sorry," perhaps, "I love you." Her shoulders shook, but she kept her eyes fixed on her daughter. Judge Hayes leaned forward ever so slightly. In all her years on the bench, she had never seen a moment like this. She was not one to allow emotion to guide her decisions, but even she could not deny that the silence itself carried weight. Richard remained crouched, his tone patient, coaxing, but never pressing. "Emily, if you can you tell Rex what happens when it's too loud?" The silence deepened again. Emily's hand found Rex's fur, and she stroked it slowly, her breathing evening out. The dog's calm gaze seemed to anchor her, grounding her in a world that felt too big, too frightening. The jury leaned closer, hardly daring to breathe. Emily parted her lips, her eyes still locked on Rex. She whispered something so soft it barely registered at first. Then, louder, trembling but audible, "Mommy cries." The words hung in the air like a fragile thread. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was no longer empty. It was truth raw, simple, and undeniable. The prosecutor said nothing more. He knew the silence itself had become the testimony. And though the defense attorney bristled, the jury was already leaning into the weight of the moment. They had felt the silence, heard it broken, and they understood that more was coming. The truth had only just begun to surface. Rex shifted slightly at Emily's feet, stretching out one paw across the wooden floor as if to say, "I'm here. Don't be afraid." His dark eyes lifted to her, steady and unblinking. Emily's small fingers slid down from her stuffed rabbit to brush his fur again. It was softer than she expected, warm, alive, reassuring in a way nothing else in the room felt. The courtroom was silent, yet the silence no longer carried the weight of fear alone. It was waiting for her. Emily bent her head closer to Rex, whispering words too soft for the first row to catch. But the dog's ears perked, and his tail wagged once, a slow, steady beat against the wood. "What did you tell him, Emily?" Richard Coleman asked gently. He kept his distance this time, realizing that his presence seemed to make her retreat. "You don't have to tell us if you don't want to. But if you think Rex would want us to know, you can tell him again, louder." Emily's lips pressed together. She stroked Rex's ear with her tiny hand, the rabbit forgotten for the moment on her lap. Her voice trembled, but she leaned closer to him. "I hid." The word was soft, almost swallowed by the stillness. But it was clear enough. The jurors exchanged glances. Some wrote it down, others simply stared. The weight of that single phrase, "I hid," was more powerful than hours of testimony. Children didn't hide unless there was something to fear. The defense attorney shifted in her chair, her fingers tapping against the table with nervous rhythm. She wanted to object, to remind the jury that children at this age played games, that hiding could mean many things. But she could feel the tide turning, and she hesitated. Emily leaned closer into Rex's neck, her voice quivering but growing a touch steadier. "He was loud," she whispered, her words tumbling out as if she couldn't hold them back anymore. "He scared me." Mommy cried. The room froze. For the first time, the child's fragmented words formed a picture, a small, blurry snapshot of a world behind closed doors. Richard didn't press further. He knew he didn't have to. Pushing her could make her retreat again. Instead, he let the silence hang, giving her space to continue if she chose. Emily's hand tightened in Rex's fur, and she began rocking slightly on the chair. Her stuffed rabbit slipped from her lap and fell to the floor, but she didn't notice. She whispered again, this time directly to Rex's ear, as though telling him a secret no one else could hear. Rex's tail swished once more, slow and calm, his gaze steady on hers. He was listening, truly listening, in a way no adult could. The jury leaned forward, straining to catch the fragments. Finally, Emily lifted her face from Rex's fur. "I was in the closet," she said softly, her voice just loud enough now to carry through the room. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. The picture sharpened. The little girl, hiding in a closet, listening to shouts and cries too big for her world. Her mother covered her face with her hands, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Her shoulders trembled as she mouthed words no one else could hear. The defense attorney sprang up. "Objection. Sit down, Miss Pierce," Judge Hayes interrupted sharply. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. "The witness is speaking freely." Emily bent her head again, pressing her forehead to Rex's. "I didn't like the closet. It was dark. But Rex isn't scary. He's good." Her tiny hand clung to his collar, as if anchoring herself in his presence. For a moment, even the attorneys said nothing. The child wasn't speaking to them. She wasn't speaking to the judge or the jury. She was speaking to the dog, pouring out her memories because he asked nothing in return. Richard cleared his throat, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Emily, can you tell Rex why you hid in the closet?" Emily looked at him, then back at Rex. She whispered again, as if the dog alone was worthy of her truth. "Because I didn't want him to find me." The words dropped into the courtroom like stones. The jury shifted uncomfortably. One of the women on the panel pressed a hand to her chest, fighting back tears. The defense attorney rose again, flustered. "Your Honor, this is nothing but the imagination of a child." "We can't." "Enough," Judge Hayes said firmly. Her gavel struck once. "The witness is a child. She will testify in her own way. We will not interrupt her again." Emily tilted her head against Rex's fur, her voice faint but steady now. "I told Bunny," she said, referring to her stuffed rabbit. "I told him I was scared. But Bunny didn't help me. He's just a toy. But Rex listens. Rex knows." The dog's tail swished again. The courtroom had never been quieter. Reporters, who usually scribbled furiously, sat frozen in their seats, their pens poised above notepads, but unmoving. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. The moment stretched long, fragile, and heavy. For the first time since the trial began, the truth wasn't being pieced together by experts, reports, or arguments. It was being told broken, simple, and pure from the mouth of the one person who had lived it. And she wasn't speaking to them. She was speaking to a dog. By the time Judge Hayes called another recess, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale as one. People blinked, realizing they had been holding their breath. Some jurors rubbed their temples, already haunted by the child's words. Emily slid off the witness chair and immediately wrapped both arms around Rex's neck. Her stuffed rabbit lay forgotten on the floor until Officer Daniels gently picked it up and handed it back to her. She took it absent-mindedly, but never loosened her grip on Rex. The spectators shuffled out, buzzing with low whispers. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others wiped at damp eyes. Reporters hurried toward the payphones in the hallway, already crafting headlines about a courtroom broken open by a child and a dog. But inside the chamber, the echoes of Emily's words lingered, heavier than any evidence shown so far. "I hid. I didn't want him to find me." The defense attorney gathered her papers with trembling hands, her earlier confidence rattled. The prosecutor simply sat, staring at the child who had spoken more in half an hour than he had dared hope for in weeks. And at the center of it all, Emily clung to Rex, her tiny face buried in his fur. For the first time since the trial began, she wasn't just surviving the courtroom. She was surviving her story. And everyone in that room knew the connection between the child and the dog had become the key to unlocking a truth too heavy for her to carry alone. The hush that fell over the courtroom after recess was unlike any silence that had come before. It wasn't born of skepticism, nor of impatience. It was anticipation palpable, trembling, charged with the weight of something everyone sensed was about to happen. Emily was led back to the stand, her rabbit clutched tight under one arm, Rex padding obediently beside her. Officer Daniels guided her gently into her seat, then stepped back. The K-9 sat at her feet, his posture steady, as though he understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Emily adjusted herself nervously, her tiny legs swinging above the floor. She glanced at her mother briefly, then quickly looked away. The stuffed rabbit shifted in her lap, but her other hand never left Rex's fur. He was her shield, her confidant, her bridge into a world too frightening to face alone. Richard Coleman didn't rise immediately. He let the moment breathe, giving the jury time to see the small figure in the witness chair. When he finally stood, he approached with the same gentle tone as before. "Emily," he said softly, "you're doing such a good job. Rex is very proud of you." Emily peeked at Rex. His tail gave a small thump. The tiniest smile flickered across her lips, so fleeting it was almost missed. Richard crouched a little, keeping his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You told Rex before that you hid. Do you remember?" Emily nodded, her eyes locked on the dog. "Would you like to tell Rex more about that day?" The room grew still, everyone leaning forward, as though afraid even a breath might shatter the fragile thread that held the child's courage. Emily hesitated, squeezing Bunny's ear. Then she leaned closer to Rex, whispering at first. "I hid in the closet. It was dark." Richard didn't interrupt. He let her find her rhythm. Emily's eyes darted toward her mother again. Her lips trembled, but she pressed on. "He was yelling. He threw things. Mommy told me to hide, so I went in the closet." A juror stifled a gasp. Another pressed her lips tight, blinking furiously against tears. The words were simple, fragmented, but they painted a vivid picture of violence, chaos, a mother shielding her child. Richard swallowed hard, then asked gently, "Who told you to hide, Emily?" "Mommy," she whispered. She said, "Don't come out." Her mother broke down in sobs, shoulders shaking. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, but didn't object. She knew an interruption now would look cruel, even desperate. Emily's voice grew steadier as she clung to Rex. It was loud. He was scary. Mommy was crying. I put my hands on my ears, but I still heard it. Richard's throat tightened. "What did you hear, Emily?" She hugged Bunny tight, then buried her face briefly in Rex's neck before answering. "He hit her." The room froze. The words were not shouted, not dramatic. They were soft, childlike, but heavy with truth. "He hit Mommy," Emily repeated, a little louder this time, as though Rex's steady presence gave her strength. The jury's collective breath seemed to leave their bodies at once. One man's jaw clenched so hard the muscles twitched in his cheek. The older woman dabbed at her eyes again. Richard forced his voice to stay calm. "How do you know he hit Mommy, sweetheart?" Emily looked at him, then turned back to Rex. Her small hand traced the curve of his collar as if reminding herself who she was really talking to. "Because she fell down, and she cried louder. And I heard him say, 'Bad words.'" A low murmur rippled through the gallery, silenced only by Judge Hayes's sharp rap of the gavel. Emily rocked gently in her seat, eyes focused on Rex. "I didn't want to come out, but Mommy told me to stay." I held Bunny real tight. I tried to make him cover my ears. The image was heartbreaking. A child, alone in the dark, clutching a toy. listening to violence on the other side of the door. Richard's voice was barely audible. "Emily, did you see who hurt Mommy?" Emily nodded. Her bottom lip trembled, but her eyes, big, round, and too old for their age, remained fixed on Rex. "It was him," she whispered. Then she pointed, with a tiny, trembling hand, toward the defense table. The air sucked out of the room. All eyes turned to the man seated beside Linda Pierce. His face flushed red, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. Linda half rose, stammering. "Your Honor, I must—" "Sit down, Miss Pierce," Judge Hayes said firmly, her voice cutting like steel. Emily hugged Rex's neck, her small voice continuing without prompting. "I didn't want him to find me. I was so quiet. I was so scared." Tears streamed down her mother's face. She mouthed over and over, I'm sorry. The jury sat in stunned silence. No one scribbled notes anymore. They simply listened, their expressions heavy with the weight of what they had just heard. Rex shifted slightly, pressing his head into Emily's lap. She stroked his fur, her breathing finally slowing. It was as though the act of speaking had lifted a boulder from her chest. Richard didn't ask another question. He knew nothing he said could add to the impact of her words. The judge let the silence linger. It was not an awkward pause, but a deliberate acknowledgement of what had just been spoken. The truth had entered the room, not through polished arguments or rehearsed testimony, but through the trembling words of a 3-year-old who trusted a dog more than any adult. Finally, Judge Hayes leaned forward. Her voice was soft but resolute. The record will reflect the child's testimony as spoken. Linda Pierce sat rigid, her face pale, her pen frozen in her hand. She knew the tide had turned. No cross-examination could erase what had just been heard. Emily leaned down, whispering something into Rex's ear. His tail wagged once. She smiled faintly, the first real smile since she had entered the courtroom. And in that moment, everyone understood. The silence was broken. The truth had spoken, and nothing about the case or the town would ever be the same again. The words still hung in the air, fragile but unshakable. It was him. The silence that followed felt heavier than the testimony itself. The courtroom seemed to exist in suspended animation, as though even the dust in the sunlight had paused, unwilling to disturb the moment. No one shifted, no one coughed, no one dared to break the stillness. At the defense table, the accused man sat rigid, jaw clenched, his eyes darting briefly toward the jurors before quickly looking down. His attorney, Linda Pierce, froze with her pen still in hand, her lips parted as though she had been about to object, but thought better of it. She had practiced every legal maneuver, prepared every counter-argument, but nothing in her years of training had prepared her for this. A toddler's trembling voice, spoken not to the court, but to a dog, and yet carrying more weight than any cross-examination could undo. On the jury bench, 12 faces reflected 12 versions of the same truth, disbelief giving way to recognition. A middle-aged father leaned back, eyes glistening. A young woman dabbed the corner of her eyes with a crumpled tissue. One man folded his arms across his chest, but his gaze never wavered from the defendant. Each juror was being pulled, slowly but unmistakably, toward the same conclusion. Judge Hayes adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. Yet in the subtle tightening around her eyes, the firm set of her jaw, one could see the impact. She had presided over countless cases, heard liars, manipulators, and truth-tellers alike, but the voice of this child had pierced through every layer of doubt that legal arguments often tangled themselves in. At the prosecutor's table, Richard Coleman sat still, hands resting quietly on the desk. He didn't need to add another word. He knew they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Emily had spoken, and her words had transformed the trial. The gallery behind them was a sea of motionless faces. Some spectators wiped tears. Others leaned forward, their bodies tense with the kind of fascination that bordered on reverence. Reporters gripped their pens tightly, trying to capture the enormity of what had unfolded. One headline already formed in a journalist's mind. Toddler breaks silence in court with police dog at her side. Emily, unaware of the magnitude of her words, stroked Rex's fur with the calmness of a child who had finally let go of a heavy secret. The dog nuzzled closer, his presence steady, as though he understood he had guided her safely to this point. Her mother, however, was unraveling. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks as she pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs that threatened to shake the courtroom. She wanted to rush forward, to hold her daughter, to promise her she'd never have to hide again. But she remained in her seat, trembling, her grief and guilt visible to all. Linda Pierce finally rose, her voice unsteady despite her attempt at composure. "Your Honor," she began, her words clipped. Must not allow unverified statements from a child this young to be considered as fact." At 3 years old, her memory is unreliable, her perception flawed, and her ability to distinguish imagination from reality. "Sit down, Miss Pierce," Judge Hayes cut in firmly. "The court has ruled. The child's words are admissible. The jury will weigh their value." Linda faltered, her arguments crumbling before they reached the air. Slowly, she lowered herself back into her chair. For the first time in her career, she looked defeated not by the law, but by the undeniable humanity of what had just unfolded. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but resolute. "The people rest their examination." He didn't need to say more. Anything further would seem like gilding the truth that had already struck home. Judge Hayes glanced at the jury. "We will allow a recess." Her gavel struck once, a sound that echoed like a release valve. The courtroom, bound in tension for so long, finally exhaled. The jurors filed out, some visibly shaken. The gallery erupted into low murmurs, voices rising in waves of disbelief and sympathy. Reporters dashed into the hallway, telephones already ringing with editors desperate for updates. At the witness stand, Emily slid from her chair and wrapped both arms tightly around Rex's neck. She whispered into his fur, too softly for anyone else to hear. The dog wagged his tail, steady and calm, his very presence grounding her. Officer Daniels stepped forward, gently lifting the rabbit from where it had been forgotten on the stand and handing it back to Emily. She clutched it with one hand, but never let go of Rex with the other. The accused man muttered something under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. Linda Pierce placed a hand on his arm, her expression grave, her voice a low whisper. Whatever strategy she had prepared, it was unraveling before her eyes. Emily's mother finally broke down completely, her sobs echoing faintly even as the bailiff announced the recess. She bent forward, her face in her hands, the weight of guilt and relief colliding inside her. She had wanted to protect her daughter, but in protecting her, she had allowed silence to reign for too long. Now the silence was shattered, and the truth was free. In the hallway, whispers traveled fast. Some spoke of the courage of a child too young to know she was brave. Others marveled at Rex, the dog who had unlocked words no adult could reach. A few shook their heads, muttering doubts, but even those voices carried less conviction than before. Inside the courtroom, as the judge's bench emptied and lawyers gathered their notes, Richard Coleman sat still, staring at the empty witness chair. He knew this case would be remembered not for his questions, not for the arguments, but for a child who found her voice through a dog's steady presence. He also knew that the trial wasn't over. There would be cross-examinations, closing arguments, and deliberations. But deep down, he felt it. The case had already been decided in the hearts of those who mattered most. and all it had taken was the trembling voice of a 3-year-old, breaking the silence with words the world could never unhear. The jury room door closed with a heavy thud, leaving the courtroom in uneasy limbo. The gallery buzzed faintly before the bailiff called for quiet, but even then, whispers floated like smoke through the air. Reporters exchanged urgent notes, pencils scratching furiously across paper. The accused man sat hunched at the defense table, his face flushed, his attorney whispering sharp, desperate words into his ear. He nodded stiffly, though his eyes betrayed unease. On the opposite side, Richard Coleman stacked his papers neatly, though he hardly glanced at them. His case had already been argued not by him, but by the child who had spoken through fear, clutching a rabbit and a dog's fur. He leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the witness chair where Emily had sat. Empty now, it still seemed to echo with her trembling words. Emily and her mother were escorted to a quiet room down the hall during deliberations. Officer Daniels stayed near, Rex stretched at Emily's feet. She curled against the dog's side, her stuffed rabbit cradled in one arm. Every now and then she whispered into Rex's ear, and the dog's tail thumped gently, the sound a reassuring rhythm in the sterile courthouse silence. Her mother sat nearby, wringing her hands. Her face was pale, streaked with dried tears. She wanted to reach for her daughter, to hold her and never let go, but she didn't want to disturb the fragile peace Rex had given her. Instead, she whispered prayers no one else could hear, each one ending the same way. Thank you. Back in the courtroom, time moved slowly. 1 hour turned to 2. The gallery shifted, restless but unwilling to leave. Everyone knew the verdict would come quickly. Emily's testimony had cut straight to the heart of the case. Still, the waiting gnawed at them. Finally, the sound everyone had been straining for. The door to the jury room opened. 12 solemn faces filed back in, their steps heavy with the weight of what they carried. The foreman clutched a folded piece of paper in his hand. All rise, the bailiff commanded. Judge Hayes returned to the bench, her eyes steady, her gavel striking once. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreman replied. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he passed the slip of paper to the bailiff. The judge unfolded it, her eyes scanning quickly. Then she nodded. Will the defendant please rise? The man stood slowly, his face tight, his jaw rigid. Linda Pierce placed a steadying hand on his arm, though her own expression betrayed the defeat she had tried so hard to conceal. In the matter of the state versus Daniel Carter, Judge Hayes began, her voice ringing clear in the silent chamber. On the charge of aggravated assault, the jury finds the defendant guilty. The word cracked through the courtroom like a bell. Gasps and murmurs filled the air before the bailiff barked for order. The defendant's face drained of color. His knees seemed to buckle slightly as he gripped the table for support. Linda Pierce sank into her chair, staring blankly at the papers before her. She had fought hard, but the truth had fought harder. At the prosecutor's table, Richard exhaled slowly, relief etched across his features. He closed his eyes briefly, offering silent gratitude not for his own victory, but for the child whose courage had made it possible. The gallery erupted into hushed whispers, reporters scribbling frantically. Some spectators wept quietly. Others nodded firmly, as though justice had finally come to their small town. Judge Hayes banged her gavel again. Order, order in the court. Sentencing will follow at a later date. Court is adjourned. Her words brought the case to a formal close. But for those who had sat through every moment, the closure had come the moment Emily spoke. In the quiet room down the hall, Emily didn't understand the verdict, not in legal terms. But when her mother entered, tears streaming anew but her arms wide open, Emily climbed into her lap and held on tightly. It's over, baby, her mother whispered, rocking her gently. It's over. You're safe now. Emily nodded sleepily, her cheek pressed against her mother's shoulder. Her other hand reached down until it found Rex's fur again. She patted him softly, her eyes drooping. Officer Daniels watched quietly, his expression unreadable, but his chest swelling with quiet pride. Rex had done what no human could. He hadn't just sat at the child's side, he had given her courage, anchored her voice, and in doing so, helped justice find its way. Richard entered a few minutes later. He didn't interrupt the reunion. He simply placed a hand on the back of the chair and leaned slightly toward Emily. You are very brave today, Emily, he said softly. You helped a lot of people understand what really happened. Emily blinked at him sleepily, then turned her gaze back to Rex. She whispered something into the dog's ear, too faint for anyone else to catch. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor in response. Richard smiled faintly. He didn't need to know the words. They were hers alone, shared with the one she trusted most. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Headlines appeared across the state. Toddler's testimony with canine turns courtroom silent. Child finds her voice through police dog. Television anchors debated the precedent, while townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the trial that had shaken their community. But for Emily, the world shrank back down to simpler things. Safety, her mother's embrace, the quiet comfort of Bunny, and the steady companionship of Rex. The shadows of the closet no longer loomed quite so large. Her mother enrolled in counseling, determined to rebuild not just her own strength, but the trust of her daughter. Each night, as Emily drifted to sleep, she whispered the same words into her child's ear. You're safe. You're brave. You'll never have to hide again. As for Rex, he returned to his duties with Officer Daniels, but he was never forgotten in that courthouse. To those who had been there, he wasn't just a police dog. He was the bridge between silence and truth, the listener who heard what no adult could. On quiet evenings, Officer Daniels often scratched Rex's head and murmured, "Good boy." The dog, ever humble, wagged his tail and closed his eyes, content. And in the memory of a small town, etched deeper than any verdict, was the moment a 3-year-old girl broke a courtroom silence, not because she was asked to, but because a dog had given her the courage to speak. That was justice. That was her new beginning.